It's just saying something here too. Maybe the angels are singing, oh my gosh, the laws changed in Utah. Let's move back because we haven't done a thing, you know.
For more than a decade, the cameras had told one story. Edited smiles, rehearsed confessions, carefully lit moments of harmony. But behind the soft music and the polished voiceovers lived a family haunted by secrets. The youngest daughters had grown up believing that truth was dangerous, that love could be edited out, and that silence was safer than honesty. Tonight that silence ended. The footage opened with trembling hands, the faint sound of breathing, a single whispered line. We can't keep pretending anymore. What followed would shatter the myth that held the family together. In the beginning, before the fame and the fractured homes, there had been laughter. The sisters would curl together on the couch, watching their parents rehearse smiles for the next scene. Their mother, radiant in public, carried the exhaustion of someone who'd traded peace for control. Their father, once charismatic, had turned into a ghost that haunted every room he entered, always looking for loyalty, never looking for truth. When the leaked recording surfaced, it wasn't just another scandal. It was the sound of years of fear cracking open. The girls' voices, soft, raw, untrained, spoke about nights spent waiting for affection that never came, about the confusion of watching love measured like currency. Each word was both confession and rebirth. Across town, the other women, the ones who had escaped, watched in stunned silence. They knew this pain. They had lived it, prayed through it, buried it under polite interviews. Yet hearing it from the daughters made it unbearable. The vindication felt hollow. Victory tasted like grief. Christine pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, whispering, "They're just kids." Janelle closed her eyes, remembering her own children's tears, the birthdays missed, the endless justifications. Meri felt the ache of decades condense into a single truth. The story was finally being told, but it had taken the innocence of two young women to do it. As the leaked footage spread, the family's empire of illusions began to crumble. The public, once enchanted by the idea of plural perfection, now saw the cracks. The control, the isolation, the hierarchy of affection. Reporters called it a scandal. Those who had lived it called it freedom. Yet beneath the chaos there was something quieter. For the first time, the daughters slept without fear of being edited out of their own story. The wives, no longer bound by loyalty to a myth, began to speak not out of anger but out of mourning, for the years lost, for the love that could have been real, and for the family that had existed only on screen. The footage did more than end a show. It ended an era of pretending. Morning came without light. The sky over Flagstaff hung heavy, the color of unspoken words. Inside the old house, curtains trembled in the draft as if the walls themselves knew that something sacred had been shattered overnight. The leaked footage had traveled faster than anyone expected, shared, dissected, replayed, until every whisper from the daughters echoed through 1,000 screens. Aurora sat on the floor of her bedroom, knees pulled close, listening to the hum of her own heartbeat. The world outside was loud, notifications, headlines, opinions, but inside there was only the strange calm that follows an earthquake. She hadn't cried yet. He thought maybe she never would. But when Breanna opened the door, eyes swollen, voice small, the silence broke between them. "We did it," Breanna whispered, as if unsure whether it was triumph or tragedy. Aurora nodded. "Tao, it's real." Downstairs, their mother's phone lay face down on the counter, vibrating endlessly. She had retreated to her room hours earlier, leaving behind half-finished coffee and a trail of disbelief. For years she had been the architect of appearances, holding smiles together with rehearsed warmth, but no one had prepared her for the day when her children would become the narrators of their own pain. Across town, cameras gathered outside a different home. The wives who had once called each other sisters were suddenly bound again, not by love, but by the shared ache of recognition. Christine moved through her kitchen like a ghost, replaying the daughters' trembling voices. Every word was a mirror reflecting the moments she tried to forget, how many nights she told her own children, "It's okay, Dad's just busy," when she knew he simply wasn't coming. Janelle watched the news feed in silence. For her, the revelations weren't shocking, they were confirmation. She had always known that love given unequally becomes poison, that devotion demanded as proof becomes control. Seeing the daughters break the silence felt like watching a door she'd once feared finally swing open. Meri sat alone on her porch. The morning sun painted gold across her hands, but she felt cold. For years she had carried the weight of being the example. The obedient one, the steady one, the woman who stayed even when staying hurt. Now, as she watched the truth spill into daylight, she realized that obedience had never been loyalty. It had been fear dressed as faith. News outlets called it the sisterhood scandal. Talk shows debated responsibility. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds of sympathy and rage. But beneath the noise, something quieter was happening. The daughters who had once spoken only in whispers were learning what their voices could do. In the days that followed, Aurora began writing letters. One for each year she'd spent pretending. Breanna painted, colors bleeding together like emotions she couldn't yet name. Their mother rarely left her room. She kept the blinds drawn, replaying old footage where the family smiled beneath studio lights. Each clip was a reminder of how far love could drift when truth was edited away. The father appeared on camera once, pale and defiant. He spoke of betrayal, of loyalty, of daughters who didn't understand sacrifice. His words were polished, but his eyes betrayed panic. The look of a man watching the empire of his own certainty crumble. The wives didn't respond publicly. They didn't need to. Their silence was eloquence enough. The daughters had spoken for all of them. And yet, amid the wreckage, something unexpected began to bloom. Support poured in from strangers. Letters, artwork, messages of belief. The sisters read them aloud at night, learning that vulnerability could be strength, that telling the truth could be the beginning of healing rather than the end of a family. Weeks passed. The headlines cooled. But inside those quiet rooms, transformation continued. Christine visited them one afternoon, no cameras, no production crew, just a soft knock on the door. She brought cookies, but mostly she brought understanding. "You're brave," she told them. "Bravery doesn't always feel good at first, but it's what sets you free." That night, as the girls sat together watching the sunset bleed across the mountains, Aurora whispered, "Do you think we broke the family?" Breanna thought for a long time before answering. "No," she said finally. "I think we told the truth. Maybe it was already broken." The camera, imaginary now internal, pulled back to the vast Arizona dusk. The sound of wind through the pines carried the echo of their words, scattering them across the desert like seeds. For the first time, the story wasn't being written by a producer or shaped by a patriarch's hand. It belonged to the voices that had been quiet the longest. And in that silence after truth there was room for something new. Forgiveness, perhaps, not the easy kind that forgets, but the harder kind that lets you breathe again. Days turned into weeks and the world kept moving, but inside the echo of that family's story, time felt slower, thicker, as if each moment had to be carried carefully or it might collapse. The cameras that once lived in every corner were gone now. The lights that had warmed the rooms too brightly had been packed away. What was left was the sound of ordinary life returning. Footsteps, birds, the creak of a door that hadn't been opened in years. Aurora and Breanna no longer hid from mirrors. They looked older somehow, not in years but in awareness. The silence that used to suffocate now felt like oxygen. Sometimes they still woke in the night, startled by memories of the show's artificial laughter, of the way everyone had learned to smile on cue. But when they reached for each other's hands in the dark, there was no camera watching, no director whispering, "Do that again but happier." Their mother tried to reach them. She wrote long messages about misunderstanding, about love twisted by pressure, about how she never meant for harm to bloom out of ambition. They read the messages, everyone, but didn't reply. There were no words large enough yet for forgiveness. Across the state line, the other women began to rebuild. Christine filled her house with music. Her daughters came and went freely, the air always alive with conversation. Janelle spent more time outdoors, tending to small gardens that didn't ask her to pretend. Meri, still quiet, found a kind of peace in solitude. She started a journal, writing not for the world but for herself. Pages full of questions, pages full of hope. The father withdrew. Once the center of everything, he became the ghost of his own creation. Interviews stopped. Public statements faded. His reflection in old reruns looked foreign, as though he were watching someone else's life unravel. He blamed everyone and no one. When he walked through town, people still recognized him, but the recognition came with silence instead of applause. For the daughters, fame had turned into something softer. People recognizing their bravery instead of their family name. At first, that kindness was hard to trust. But slowly, through letters, through small moments of connection, they learned that truth can build a new kind of belonging. One evening, when the desert light was fading, Aurora and Breanna climbed the ridge behind their home. From up there, the town looked small, like a model of its former self. The wind was cold. The world smelled of dust and juniper. "I used to think we'd never get out," Aurora said. Breanna smiled barely. "Maybe we didn't get out. Maybe we just finally arrived." They stood together for a long time, watching the last orange burn out of the sky. Below them, life continued. Cars, laughter, a dog barking, but up there was stillness. It wasn't the kind of peace they had imagined, but it was real, and it was theirs. When they came down, they found Christine waiting at the gate with hot chocolate and that same quiet understanding she always carried. "The hardest part isn't speaking," she said softly, handing them the cups. "It's learning to live after you do." Aurora nodded. "We're learning." And they were. Slowly. Imperfectly. But learning all the same. Years passed, but the echoes of the past never completely faded. The daughters, once shadows in the glare of manipulation, now carried themselves with an unshakable authority. Aurora's voice, once small and uncertain, became a guiding light for teenagers navigating fractured homes, parents who wielded control like armor, and communities still learning to recognize emotional coercion for what it was. She traveled to schools, libraries, and forums, her words striking hard and soft at the same time. "Your experiences are valid. Your voice matters. You do not owe obedience to fear." Each time she spoke, she glimpsed her younger self in the crowd, hesitant, afraid, but capable of witnessing the truth she had long been denied. Breanna, meanwhile, found expression in art. Her sketches became exhibitions, galleries, and books. They were raw, intimate, and unapologetic. The world she had lived in, the truth of living under a veil of performance, the suffocating pressure of a family ruled by deception. Viewers wept, nodded, and left transformed. Some felt her pain, some recognized their own. Breanna's art became a movement, a visual testament to the resilience of those who had been silenced, a mirror that refused to lie. Christine, whose voice had always carried a rare mixture of gentleness and steel, became a political and cultural advocate. Her TED Talk, Loving Loud, Healing After Hidden Abuse, circulated worldwide, amassing millions of views within months. She testified before Congress about emotional abuse in high-control relationships, confronting lawmakers with quiet conviction, demanding policies that protected children and adults alike. Her memoir, From Obedience to Voice, climbed bestseller lists globally, inspiring women and men to reclaim autonomy over their own narratives. She became not merely a survivor but a symbol of empowerment, proof that one voice, once amplified, could challenge entrenched systems of control. Janelle, the phoenix of the family, continued to grow her nonprofit, Rise Up Strong, into a nationwide network. Housing programs, educational grants, financial workshops, and counseling services reached thousands of women trapped in cycles of dependency and spiritual coercion. She authored Polygamy's Price Tag, The Economics of Emotional Servitude, an exposé that dissected the mechanisms of financial control within the Brown family, blending memoir with practical strategies for liberation. Her words resonated far beyond reality television audiences, teaching women that freedom could be measured not only in emotional survival but in financial independence and self-determination. Meri, often quiet but profoundly present, transformed her retreat centers into sanctuaries for reflection, healing, and reclamation. The Oregon Lake House became a pilgrimage site for women seeking to rewrite their own stories. She taught them to confront the traumas of family and faith, not as victims but as architects of a new reality. Her methods were simple yet revolutionary. Listen to the body, honor the mind, trust the voice. Through her programs, countless women and children learned that silence is not virtue, that speaking is not rebellion, and that healing requires courage beyond what the world often expects. Robyn, by contrast, became a cautionary tale. Her attempts at reclaiming control through memoirs, voicemails, and social media only highlighted the limits of manipulation once the truth had emerged. The public, previously captivated by her carefully curated persona, turned away from her narrative. Retailers refused her book. Interviews were declined. Even her daughters, once under her influence, had forged identities strong enough to reject her. She had built her life as if it were a stage, but the curtains had closed. In the end, her vanishing act was permanent, not heroic but inevitable. a testament to the collapse of control built on fear and deceit. Kody's story was quieter, more somber. The man who had once tried to manage love and loyalty like currency now lived in solitude, weathered by remorse and reflection. Though his relationship with his older children remained fractured, he eventually found a form of reconciliation through silence and accountability. He rebuilt slowly, learning that presence, honesty, and humility could never be simulated or forced. They had to be earned through action, not assertion. The cultural impact of the Brown family's unraveling reverberated far beyond Flagstaff or Utah. Podcasts, documentaries, and academic papers cited their story as a case study in coercive family dynamics, the psychology of manipulation, and the empowerment that comes from speaking truth to systemic control. Therapy groups formed around discussions of Sister Strong, the daughter's testimony, and the mother's reclamation of selfhood. People began using phrases once exclusive to internet fandom, breaking the pattern, from silence to voice. We were wives, now we are women, as mantras for personal liberation, tools for advocacy, and symbols of resilience. The final cinematic moments, captured by the lone fan in Sedona, became iconic. Christine, Meri, and Janelle sitting on the patio, coffee cups in hand, laughing openly, unguarded, free. Their smiles were not scripted. Their words were unedited. And when Christine wrote in her journal, "True love doesn't clip your wings, it lets you fly," it became more than a line, it became a legacy. 1 year later, the daughters joined them, completing the circle. Together, they were not a family defined by control, deception, or television drama. They were a lineage of courage, testimony, and transformation, a story no longer dictated by fear but by authenticity. Even the wider world felt the aftershocks. Forums that once speculated on trivial drama became spaces for serious discussion about emotional abuse, family manipulation, and systemic coercion. Social media campaigns emerged, sharing tools, support, and stories of personal liberation. Influencers and advocates cited the Brown women's journey as evidence that truth could survive and even thrive against the loudest falsehoods. And somewhere, in quiet reflection, Aurora and Breanna stood as the living bridge between the past and the future. They were the daughters who refused to remain silent, who bore witness to the manipulations and lies, who turned trauma into action. Their voices were steady now, unwavering and unassailable. They had learned that freedom was never given. It was seized, earned, and defended. And in that act, they had transcended their childhood, their family drama, and the shadow of Robyn's control. The desert sun rose once again over the horizon, spilling golden light across the mountains, the valleys, the towns below. The Brown women, mothers and daughters alike, looked on not with bitterness but with clarity. They were alive. They were seen. They were free. And for the first time in decades, the world watched not as spectators of scandal, but as witnesses to resilience, liberation, and the indomitable power of truth. The fallout from the leaks, the confessions, and the public unraveling of Robyn Brown continued to echo through every corner of the family's life, reshaping their world in ways that no camera could capture. Aurora and Breanna, once timid observers in the theater of their mother's control, emerged as voices of unflinching clarity. They spoke publicly but not for revenge, only for truth. In interviews, podcasts, and panels, they recounted the manipulation, the rehearsed confessions, and the subtle punishments that had shaped their childhood. Their words hit hard. Every audience member felt the weight of parental betrayal, the pressure of loyalty coerced through fear, and the courage it took to finally stand unbowed. Each revelation was a hammer against the fragile facade their mother had built. Every sentence they uttered chipped away at the myth of Robyn's perfection. The mothers, Christine, Janelle, and Meri, had become pillars of resilience, each redefining her life in ways that transcended reality television. Christine's memoir, From Obedience to Voice, became more than a book. It was a manifesto, a call to action for survivors of coercive systems. She traveled relentlessly, speaking at conferences, universities, and survivor retreats, her voice cutting through decades of silence. When she recounted the years of emotional manipulation, the audience didn't just listen. They absorbed, reflected, and were transformed. Every tear she shed, every story she told, became a beacon of validation for those who had once believed that fear and obedience were the only paths to love. Janelle turned her trauma into strategy. Her nonprofit, Rise Up Strong, blossomed into a nationwide organization, offering women in oppressive environments access to legal aid, financial literacy, and safe housing. Her second book, Polygamy's Price Tag: The Economics of Emotional Servitude, unveiled the hidden structures of control, the joint debts, the manipulated finances, the enforced dependence that kept women tethered to a patriarchal system. Readers across the country were stunned, inspired, and enraged. Janelle's calm, methodical voice became a clarion call, proving that survival was not just endurance. It was transformation into empowerment. Meri, ever the quiet force, created spaces for reflection and reclamation. Her retreats in Utah and Oregon became sanctuaries for women and children, safe spaces to process trauma, reclaim autonomy, and envision lives built on self-determination rather than coercion. Every weekend, participants shared stories, penned letters to the younger versions of themselves, and left with tools to confront toxic family dynamics. Meri's approach was gentle but unyielding. She reminded them that liberation was a process, a daily choice, and that breaking generational cycles required courage, patience, and unwavering commitment. Robyn Brown, the architect of deception, had vanished from public view, leaving only whispers and fragmented memories behind. Her attempts to rewrite history through memoirs, social media, and voicemails failed spectacularly, exposing the limits of control built on fear and performative virtue. Retailers refused her books, the public rejected her narrative, and even her daughters had moved past her influence. Her once commanding presence had been reduced to silence and shadows, a haunting reminder that manipulation cannot withstand the persistent light of truth. Kody, meanwhile, became a figure of quiet reflection. The man who had once tried to balance love, loyalty, and public image like a ledger now lived in seclusion. His reconciliations with older children were tentative, mediated through letters, therapy, and patient listening. Each encounter was a delicate dance of accountability and humility. He began to understand that true presence, honest, patient, and unobtrusive, was worth more than control or dominance. For the first time, he experienced the profound emptiness of ego unanchored by power, and slowly, painfully, he learned the foundations of redemption. Culturally, the Brown family's saga evolved from entertainment into a social phenomenon. Documentaries, podcasts, and university lectures analyzed their story as a case study in emotional coercion, manipulation, and the reclamation of autonomy. Social media transformed from spaces of gossip into forums for education, advice, and survivor solidarity. Phrases like "breaking the pattern," "we were wives, now we are women," and "speaking truth to control" entered the public lexicon, becoming mantras for empowerment. The daughters' voices, once hidden in the shadows, became part of the soundtrack for a generation learning to resist coercion in families, communities, and institutions. The cinematic closure came in quiet moments. Christine, Janelle, and Meri sitting on a sunlit patio, coffee cups in hand, laughing freely for the first time in decades. Aurora and Breanna joined them later, their presence completing the circle. The laughter wasn't scripted. The smiles weren't performative. The truth was raw, simple, and undeniable. Christine's journal entry captured it best. "True love doesn't clip your wings, it lets you fly. And we finally fly together, unchained, unafraid, and whole." The desert wind carried the sound of liberation, sweeping away decades of secrecy, manipulation, and fear. The Brown women had reclaimed their stories, their power, and their lives. And the world, long fascinated with scandal, paused to witness something rarer: enduring courage, resilience, and the triumph of truth over control. The saga of the Brown family, once dominated by secrecy, control, and relentless performance, now centered on the next generation, the daughters. Aurora, Breanna, Savannah, Aspen, and Mykelti had grown up under the weight of a family built on rigid hierarchies, manipulative alliances, and the shadow of a mother whose charisma masked coercion. Yet as they stepped into adulthood, they were no longer pawns in Robyn's carefully orchestrated theater. They were witnesses, survivors, and ultimately narrators of their own stories. The first public statement from Aurora and Breanna was seismic. The sisters appeared together on a documentary special titled "Breaking the Pattern," a handheld, raw, unfiltered chronicle of their experiences. They opened dusty boxes of childhood memories, dog-eared scripts from Sister Wives episodes, diaries filled with trembling handwriting, and Polaroids of family moments that had once been weaponized against them. As they flipped through the pages, The audience could see the internal struggle, the mix of love for a parent and the clarity of betrayal. "We weren't collateral damage," Aurora said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "We were witnesses, and we were silent for too long." The revelations that followed were devastating in their candor. Breanna spoke of the rehearsed confessions, how Robyn coached them to speak ill of the other wives while praising her manipulations. She described how loyalty was enforced through emotional withdrawal, isolation, and subtle threats disguised as guidance. Every memory recounted was a thread unraveling the tapestry of deception Robyn had woven around them. Savannah, quiet but resolute, explained that the sisters had once feared speaking out, not because of shame but because truth was equated with disloyalty. Yet now speaking was survival, and survival demanded honesty. Meanwhile, Christine, Janelle, and Meri stood firmly by them, not as enablers but as mentors and witnesses to resilience. Christine's work with survivor communities provided frameworks for understanding and healing from emotional manipulation. Janelle's nonprofit offered tangible tools for rebuilding independence, while Meri's retreats created sanctuaries for reclaiming agency. The daughters saw firsthand that the women who had once been trapped by patriarchal and polygamous structures had now become architects of freedom, and they drew courage from their example. The broader public watched in awe. Breaking the pattern did not just recount personal stories. It became a cultural event, sparking national conversations about family systems, emotional coercion, and the long-term effects of growing up in environments where love was conditional. Social media exploded with hashtags. #breaking the pattern, #daughtersspeak, #from pawns to power. The Brown daughters' courage inspired others to examine their own histories, question authority, and reclaim autonomy. Their bravery was contagious. Counselors, journalists, and advocacy groups cited their testimony as a defining moment in conversations about emotional abuse and systemic manipulation. Even Robyn, once untouchable in her carefully crafted public persona, had become a ghost in the narrative. Attempts to reassert control through memoirs, voicemails, or live streams failed spectacularly. Her daughter's testimony made any facade impossible to maintain. Retailers pulled her book, fans rejected her narrative, and the court of public opinion had already passed judgment. She had built her identity on the obedience of others. Once that obedience was gone, so was her influence. Robyn's absence became a haunting counterpoint to the daughters' rise. A reminder that power rooted in manipulation is ephemeral, while truth endures. Kody's role, too, shifted dramatically. Once a central figure, his story became one of reflection and reconciliation. He appeared in controlled interviews, admitting the failures of his past, acknowledging the blind spots that allowed Robyn's manipulation to dominate family life, and expressing tentative hopes for renewed relationships with some of his children. The man who had once been caught between love, loyalty, and ego now stood quietly in the background, a figure of regret, learning to respect boundaries and allowing the women and their children to reclaim the narrative. The daughters' emergence culminated in a reunion unlike any previously aired. In a serene, sunlit studio stripped of cameras, scripts, and production staff, they sat together, sisters bound not by obligation, but by shared experience and mutual understanding. Tears were shed, stories were confirmed, and the chain of deception that had once defined their lives was broken, piece by piece. They spoke candidly about their mother's attempts at control, the manipulation they endured, and the love they still held for one another despite the fractures. Their voices, once muted, resonated with clarity, authority, and undeniable authenticity. Ultimately, the narrative of the Brown family transformed from one of spectacle to one of profound human insight. The daughters had taken the chaos of polygamy, manipulation, and betrayal and forged from it a legacy of resilience, truth, and empowerment. They became living proof that the cycles of abuse could be broken, that silence could be replaced by voice, and that courage could emerge even from the darkest of childhoods. The story of Aurora, Breanna, Savannah, Aspen, and Mykelti was no longer about drama or scandal. It was about reclamation, justice, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. The closing scene was quiet yet cinematic. The five sisters walking together through a desert canyon, sunlight glinting off the rocks, wind tousling their hair. There were no cameras, no scripts, no staged moments. Just them together, finally free from the shadows of a past that had sought to define them. Aurora glanced at her sisters and whispered, This is ours. All of it. We take it back. And in that moment the narrative shifted forever. The daughters were no longer defined by deception. They defined themselves fully, fiercely, and without apology. The saga of the Brown family, once dominated by secrecy, control, and relentless performance, now centered on the next generation, the daughters. Aurora, Breanna, Savannah, Aspen, and Mykelti had grown up under the weight of a family built on rigid hierarchies, manipulative alliances, and the shadow of a mother whose charisma masked coercion. Yet as they stepped into adulthood, they were no longer pawns in Robyn's carefully orchestrated theater. They were witnesses, survivors, and ultimately narrators of their own stories. The first public statement from Aurora and Breanna was seismic. The sisters appeared together on a documentary special titled Breaking the Pattern, a handheld, raw, unfiltered chronicle of their experiences. They opened dusty boxes of childhood memories, dog-eared scripts from Sister Wives episodes, diaries filled with trembling handwriting, and Polaroids of family moments that had once been weaponized against them. As they flipped through the pages, the audience could see the internal struggle, the mix of love for a parent and the clarity of betrayal. "We weren't collateral damage," Aurora said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "We were witnesses, and we were silent for too long." The revelations that followed were devastating in their candor. Breanna spoke of the rehearsed confessions, how Robyn coached them to speak ill of the other wives while praising her manipulations. She described how loyalty was enforced through emotional withdrawal, isolation, and subtle threats disguised as guidance. Every memory recounted was a thread unraveling the tapestry of deception Robyn had woven around them. Savannah, quiet but resolute, explained that the sisters had once feared speaking out, not because of shame but because truth was equated with disloyalty. Yet now speaking was survival, and survival demanded honesty. Meanwhile, Christine, Janelle, and Meri stood firmly by them, not as enablers but as mentors and witnesses to resilience. Christine's work with survivor communities provided frameworks for understanding and healing from emotional manipulation. Janelle's